Hey everybody, it's Reverend David and my trusty ministry assistant pilot, the St. Bernard. We've been out of this space for a few weeks now. This place has been pretty darn empty, so I thought I'd come back through and record a little bit in this empty house and give a little bit of a tour through the place in a few different videos. This sanctuary, one of the things that people often say when they come in is, this does not look like a Unitarian church. What was this before the Unitarians bought it? But the reality is this is built as a Unitarian church, one of the relatively few Unitarian Gothic-style pieces of architecture that are here in North America. It was built over the course of 1929 to 1931. Morton Dennison Hull, who was a U.S. rep for a little bit and a very wealthy benefactor of the church, gave $1 million gift to build it, and then another equally large gift to anchor the endowment for its upkeep. More about that in a different video. On the condition, and this is so Chicago to me, Hull said, I'm going to give this gift and I'm going to build this church on the condition that my son is the architect of it. I feel like that is so Chicago in 1929. When von Ogden Vogt was called to this congregation, they said, come serve us. He hadn't been Unitarian, he'd been a congregational minister on the north side. They said, come accept the call to this congregation down here in Hyde Park, and we'll build you a new church. This is not an offer that was made to Terry and I when we came here. But we did the capital campaign last year and did more than $1 million, so there you go. Von Ogden Vogt was excited about building a church, was excited about actually creating a church, in part because in the 1920s he had, and then on and through the 30s and 40s, he had done a lot of thinking and a lot of writing about church not just as this purely internal experience, not just as something that happens inside your head when you're in the building, but church as an embodied and an aesthetic experience. That church shouldn't just be about what you're thinking when you're there. Church should not just be about the words that the preacher is saying, for example. Church is about worship. The experience of worship is about the totality of life, which is something that's embodied, which is something that is beautiful, which is something that isn't just about your head, but your heart, your soul, your spirit, your compassion, and your mind, all of these things together. And so when he built this building, our very attentive St. Bernard, when he built this building, he's thinking about all of those things, and he's trying to put all of that stuff into practice. And so part of what's happening is when you come through these doors, here we are, I've just come through the doors at the back of the sanctuary, he wants you to feel this sense. He wants you to have this physical reaction to being in this space of uplift, of expansiveness, of spaciousness, this feeling of immensity, this feeling of a trajectory, right? This sort of trajectory that starts at the back of the church here, sort of on ground level, and takes you, by the time you get to the front, up and out and through that stained glass window and up to what he calls the overworld of the one, to God, the cosmos, the vastness of the universe and life itself. And he doesn't want you just to think about that. He wants you to have that feeling of lifted upness just by physically walking into the space, even if you have no other ideas about it. So, for example, he writes about having the arches be pointed up there, right? Not just be perfectly rounded barrel vaults, but come to points, because there's a sense still of motion in a point, that it's still taking you somewhere rather than just containing what's here. He talks about an altar at the front of a church, and he's writing about this before these ideas bear fruit in the physical space, as having a low focal point. So there's the low altar there and the candles, and a high focal point, that window that carries you up and onwards and out into the universe. This building is pure stone masonry. So unlike almost all of the other stone churches that are built, in fact, this is the last pure stone masonry church built in the city of Chicago. If you go just down the block to Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago, this beautiful gargantuan Gothic building. It's actually stone over steel. So it's all steel columns and steel reinforced, and then they've wrapped stone around it. The same way a lot of our brick buildings, like a 6 or an 8 unit condo building, is actually a wooden frame building that they've just put a brick facade up in front of. But part of what VOV, von Ogden Vogt, wanted in this space was he wants the thing to really be what it is, not to be deceiving you into feeling like it's more permanent, but to actually be the thing. He has this sense, this notion that you experience the steadiness of it, the fullness of this thing, by really being real, the volume of it, the weight of it. You look at these pillars, right? These pillars are way bigger than what you'd see in a steel building that just has stone around them, relative to its size. He has this marvelous line, and I don't, it's hard to read tongue-in-cheek 90 years later, but I think he's serious, and I find it really beautiful. He says, calm repose and a steadfast endurance of the spirit is induced by a clean wall of stone well laid. I guess that could use a little more cleaning. But again, he has this sense that physically you're having a response to this space. I love one of our former members who's now passed on, told me one time, she said, every time I come into this church, I think, what am I doing in this pile of rocks? And she's not wrong. So there are also reactions which are not what Vogt intended. All along the space, high up, there are these symbols inlaid in marble, and along the length of the sanctuary here, these are all symbols of different professions. Let's see. So you got second from the right or second from the left, you've got bakers, I think. You've got saw and hammer for construction. On this side, you have the quill and briefcase for lawyers and the medicine bottle for pharmacists, and academic hat and book, and they go on and on, including things we don't really even have anymore, dynamos for electricity, and steam railroad trains, and an icon for shipping, for the shipping industry, which is so cool. And also, it's the one right there, predates containerization. So it's an artifact of its time also. But what he's thinking in placing these symbols along the length of the sanctuary is this idea that when you come to church, you're not supposed to leave some part of yourself behind. It's not like church is this place where we're supposed to be like these, perfectly pure and excellent, overachieving people all the time. The idea is that you come into this house with all of yourself, and part of that is your profession. It's not just the totality of your emotional experience that you're bringing into church, but also your vocation. That there isn't a separation between who you are as a person committed to your faith, to your spiritual path, however you want to call it, right? That's not like one person over here, and then you at work is this different person over here. The idea is he's deliberately putting these symbols up there to say, no, you're bringing all of who you are into this house. The work is to live an undivided life. And that work is sacred, too. That there's not one arena in which we live out our values and a different arena in which we make money. The point is that it's all one, it's all together. So, I said earlier that part of what he's doing here is saying that it's the total experience of worship that matters, not just the words that are being spoken. And part of what he's doing in the space here, by putting the lectern all the way on one side, right, and the pulpit all the way on the other side. Well, at that time, and you've probably been in plenty of churches where the pulpit is in the middle, and the center of the chancel is just this raised area at the front of church. The center of the chancel is the pulpit. So what Vogt's saying is that the center is not the words that are being spoken. The center is not just the emotional experience. But the center is, in a certain sense, the center of the worship experience is this upward sweep, this elevation of the self and the spirit, this connection. Vogt talks about the overworld of the one, this connection to something bigger and greater than ourself. Vogt called worship the celebration of life. And if you open up one of our gray hymnals, the very first section is called the celebration of life. And what his notion is, and in the 20s and the 30s, and on through the rest of his ministry, he's very much a Unitarian Christian, but he has this extremely expansive sense of what Christianity is, this expansive sense that's big enough to encompass the plenty of humanists who were in his congregation already by the 30s. Remember that the Humanist Manifesto, the first one signed in the 30s, several of the signatories were U of C faculty. So that's part of the mix of what's happening here at that time. And that sort of expansive sense of worship as the celebration of life, of knowing where you stand on your own spiritual path and beliefs, but also knowing that your own lens that you're seeing it through isn't the be-all, end-all. He makes that real also in the tile work on the altar here. So when you look on this, there's the 6 points of a Star of David. And on this side, there's a star and crescent. So the crescent and star for Islam. And then in the center, there's 3 different styles of crosses. And I confess not knowing enough about cross styles to know yes, thank you, Pilate, for helping point these out. Is that sacrilegious? I'm not sure. Probably not for us. So the point is, in this altar, he's putting together the symbols of different religions. He's saying that it's not about this sort of narrow definition, but this really broad encompassing. And then above the altar, of course, he's putting a deliberately empty niche, so that rather than a crucifix, or rather than any particular specific conception of God, there's this emptiness, this space for you yourself to place your own concept of what that is. The overworld of the one, he says, without giving a great deal of detail of what precisely the characteristics of all of that means. He's saying, no, y'all got to do that work yourself. You got to figure that out. And there's space enough in the altar for different traditions. There's space enough in that niche for different pieces. This, behind the altar, above it, around it, there's more symbols of the natural world. So there's elements, fire and water on that side, birds and trees and fish and animals and star and planet, sun and moon, man and woman, gender binary, 1931. The totality of experience, and then this marble behind is called a reredos, and I'm sure this is not what he intended, since he predated its discovery. But it always strikes me, this to me, and this is a David interpretation, I think, and nobody else interpretation. If you've ever seen pictures of the cosmic X-ray or microwave background of the universe, satellites that have gone up into space and done these surveys of the whole universe and what it looks like, you get images that look so much like this to me. The sense of chaos, but an order that lurks inside it, just out of reach, and a representation of the universe itself. Now that's not what VOV thought of. Extraplanetary X-rays were not discovered until something like the 40s. But the point is, I love it, even without his planning, that what is at the center, what's the backdrop of all of this? The backdrop of our own space to put the holy, the backdrop of these different paths and traditions is the substance of the universe itself, the elements, people, stars, planets. The stuff of life is the backdrop to worship. Across the chancel on either side, on one, there's a symbol for death, and then on the other, a symbol for birth. And the notion is that the worship experience, this celebration of life, takes place each week between these two poles, between the defining realities, the bookends, in this case, literally the edges, the ends of where the celebration of life is, where this chancel is, lies in birth and in death. So for me, for Reverend Terry sitting over here each week on this side next to the pulpit, each Sunday, my view is right across, not to Pilate, who is not allowed in the church on Sundays, but to the death's head, which at one time struck me as sort of morbid, but I find so beautiful now, so compelling to me. And I think part of it, and I haven't found this in his writing, but my own read on it is part of what he's trying to say is these are inescapable realities. This is reality. Someone much later said, to be religious, what it means to be religious, what it means to be a spiritual person, is to face the reality and try and reconcile that we are alive and we have to die. And both of those things are real. And the facing of that, the facing of this reality is part of what we're coming to church to do. Part of what I enjoy so much about the symbols of the church and the icons that are sort of placed into the walls is that I find them to be reminders of things that are really easy to forget. Oh my God, they're so easy to forget. Reminders. I'm sorry, every time I see Pilate in the picture, I find it a little bit ridiculous. I hope that you do too. But reminders, in the symbols of the professions, reminders that our whole life is sacred, our work is sacred. And we forget this constantly. I know I forget this constantly, right? Even though the work I do is for the church. I'm sitting in a meeting, I'm working with Zoom, right? I'm trying to figure out how to post a video on YouTube. That's sacred. How do I bring that into the work? How do I not forget that? Or similarly, the aesthetic, the embodied experience of church, the sense that we are here to be whole people, and that the building itself is inviting us to do this in its upward sweep and trajectory, in the limitlessness of it, in the light coming through those windows, in the points of the arch, in the clean stone well laid that is what it is, not pretending to be stone over steel. That wholeness is something I continually forget. And I think it's just part of being human that we continually forget. And so I find it just so delightful to be called back, to remember that all around us in this place, it doesn't just happen to be this old Gothic-y looking church, that it's very deliberately crafted to remind us of these things we continually forget and remember and rediscover, and then forget them again and rediscover them again over and over and over. And that is the work, in part, coming into this house or worshiping in all our own houses, gathering on a Sunday morning, gathering to sing along with the choir over Zoom, gathering however we gather, that our work as religious people, as spiritual people, as people trying to live the fullness of our lives is to remember all these things which we continually forget and to be called back home to ourselves again. All right, I'll see you soon. Take care, y'all.